going to answer our frequently asked questions about self-harm. Hello everyone, today we're going to be talking about self-harm and the frequently asked questions about self-harm and therapy. And I have a very special guest here on the channel, and her name is Julia.
Hi there, my name is Julia Kristina and I am a registered clinical counselor and mental health therapist working out of Vancouver, British Columbia. I am also a speaker, a blogger, and a YouTuber. And my YouTube channel, Julia Kristina Counselling with 2 L's because I'm out of Canada, focuses on anything to do with mental health, wellness, personal growth, personal development, and happiness. And today I am joining, like Kristen, to talk about a pretty serious issue, the issue of self-harm.
So I reached out to Julia because I don't have all the answers about therapy yet. I am in training to be a therapist, but right now I don't have all the answers. So I wanted to get someone else's feedback on the questions you guys were asking about self-harm and therapy. The first question I get a lot on this channel. A lot of people want to know the answer to this question, and it is, if we tell our therapist or doctor that we are self-harming, does the therapist have to tell our parents?
That is a really good question, and I can't speak directly and give you a direct answer to that one because I know that laws and regulations are different from province to province and state to state, so I can't give you a final answer on that. But what I can say is, in order to get the answer that you're looking for, to just ask your therapist. Ask your therapist what the limits to confidentiality are and what they are obligated to report to both, the authorities or to your parents. And once you find that out from them, you can know whether or not they are going to be obligated to report anything around self-harm. So that would probably be your easiest and best way to get the most accurate answer to that question.
The next question, Julia, is one that's very, very hard for younger people because self-harm is a very awkward thing to bring up to anyone. And in therapy, we should be open and honest with our therapist. And if we're harming ourselves or we are struggling with something, the therapist needs to know about it so we can work on it. So the question is, Julia, how do we bring up self-harm in therapy?
Another really good question. It can be a really hard thing to bring up, and it can be really challenging to address such a personal and vulnerable issue with your therapist. Hopefully you have a good enough relationship with your therapist that you feel comfortable talking about things with them that are more personal. And if you don't feel comfortable sharing personal things with your therapist, it might be a good idea to find another therapist because you're not going to get a lot out of therapy if you can't be open and honest with them. Now that said, how do you bring up the issue of self-harm with them? You could start with something like, I've been doing something lately in order to cope with things that are going on in my life that I know is not really good for me, but I'm doing it anyways, and I just really wanted to talk about it and be able to be open and honest about that. And chances are your therapist is going to say, great, let's talk about it, let's sort through it. Another way you can do it is just dive right in and say, guess what, I've been self-harming and I need to talk about it. And most therapists will, hopefully, be open and willing to talk about it and open to hearing what you have to say and listening to what you're going through and what's going on with you and what's leading you to self-harm and why you are choosing this form of coping. So, bringing it up with your therapist can just be as simple as coming right out and saying it, or also just telling them, there's something I need to talk about. It's not necessarily something I feel really good about, but I need to process it and I need to be able to discuss it with someone that I trust and someone that is safe, and that person is you.
The next question is something that I get a lot as well. Is our therapist going to judge us if we talk about our self-harm?
Are therapists going to judge us? Well, I would hope not. Since therapists are there to support us and help us and be there for us and not to judge us, I would really hope that your therapist was not judging, and I would imagine that they aren't. If you think about it, it's really hard to judge people when they're being open and honest and vulnerable and real with us. If you think about, your close friends, when they're really open, when they really let you in and they really show you personal aspects of themselves, it's really hard to sit around and criticize and judge them. Often we just want to be there for them and support them and love them. And it's honestly quite similar with therapists. We're there to be there, to understand, to help, to support, to encourage, and to walk beside our clients. Really, if a therapist is doing their job properly and doing their job well, there is no space for judgment. And I can speak to that from my own experience in the therapy room as a therapist. There is really no space for judgment when someone is coming and being open and honest and real with us. There's lots of space for compassion, for care, for empathy, for support, for understanding, but really no space for judgment or criticism.
And the last question I want to ask Julia is, are therapists knowledgeable about self-harm as a coping technique?
And the answer to that is some therapists will be and some won't be. And if your therapist isn't as familiar with self-harm as a form of coping, teach them, tell them, inform them, talk to them about it, explain it to them. Your therapist doesn't have to know everything about everything in order to be helpful. We oftentimes really like to learn from our clients, and because each person's experience is so unique and so individual to them, even if we do know something about a certain topic, someone who is struggling with that topic or that particular issue might have a completely different take on it. So self-harm as a coping technique for you might be totally different from self-harm as a coping technique for somebody else. So the best way to talk about that with your therapist or to help your therapist understand what you're going through is to explain it to them, to talk to them about it, to share with them openly and honestly, and allow them to come along beside you in that. I know that self-harm is a really difficult thing to talk about because it's a really hard thing to acknowledge and to admit to ourselves that we're doing. And the thing is we do unhealthy or sometimes even harmful ways of coping because they work. They're not necessarily healthy, but they're helpful. And sometimes that's all that we have is what we're doing to help us cope with really difficult situations. We don't have other ways of coping. We don't know what to do with those emotions. We don't know what to do with those feelings. And so we turn to things that give us the relief we're looking for in the short term. Not necessarily in the long term, but they do give us relief in the short term, and they do help in the short term. And like I said, not necessarily healthy, not necessarily good for us in the long term, but they do help. So in addition to talking about self-harm, I think it's really also important that you talk to your therapist about what you're using self-harm to cope with. So it's one thing to deal with the self-harming behavior itself. It's another thing to deal with the thing that you're actually trying to cope with. What's going on? What's the issue? What are you struggling with? What's causing you hurt, pain, frustration, loneliness, upset? What's giving you these challenges? What are you struggling with that you're using the self-harm to deal with, to cope with? And what do you need to do with your therapist, or what conversations do you need to have with your therapist, and in order to help work through this so that you can, not need to cope with self-harm, but so that you can be thriving and feeling good and enjoying your life more.
So thank you so much, Julia, for answering our questions about self-harm. If you guys have any more questions about self-harm, leave them down below. I might make videos on them. I need more topics, put them down there. I love making these videos with collaboration. If you have a YouTuber that you would like me to reach out and collaborate with, please leave it down below. I always need suggestions about what you guys want to see on this channel. So thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.
Thanks, Kristen, and thank you for asking these really important questions and for helping people, spreading the word and helping people to get some answers to these questions that they've been asking. You are a trailblazer and an amazing young woman, and thank you so much for allowing me to be a part of this.